Welcome to SLUMBERVERSE! Oh gee, another dimension of naps!
On the night the moon wore shadows like a gentle shawl, when the lunar eclipse painted Saltmere in silver whispers, the old library dreamed with its windows open to the salt-touched air. Sage had locked the heavy oak doors at dusk, as she had for 37 years, leaving behind the familiar hum of stories settling into sleep. But tonight something different threaded through the silence, a soft resonance, like the distant memory of lullabies, drawing her back through the misted streets. She found the child curled between the poetry and atlas sections, small as a prayer book, breathing in rhythm with something far deeper than ordinary sleep. River, though Sage wouldn't learn the name until later, lay nestled against a collection of folk songs from around the world, hair the color of riverstones, catching the amber light filtering through stained glass windows. The books seemed to lean inward, as if drawn by invisible gravity, their leather spines humming with that frequency just below hearing, the way a cat purrs against your chest when you're too tired to notice, but grateful all the same. Sage knelt beside the sleeping child, her joints complaining softly, and noticed how the air itself felt different here, warmer, not with temperature, but with the kind of warmth that comes from being exactly where you belong. When she gently touched the child's shoulder, their eyes opened slowly, not with startled confusion, but with the peaceful recognition of someone returning from a very good dream. The books were singing, River said simply, sitting up with unconscious dignity. They were lonely, so I stayed to listen. Something shifted in Sage's chest, like a door she hadn't known was closed suddenly opening to let in light. In all her years surrounded by stories, she had always suspected that books held more than words, that they carried the emotional residue of every person who had ever loved them, needed them in the dark hours when the world felt too sharp around the edges. "What's your name, dear heart?" Sage asked, settling cross-legged on the worn carpet with the ease of someone who had spent decades making herself small enough for children to trust her with their secrets. "River," the child replied, then paused as if listening to something only they could hear. "The books told me you make tea that tastes like being understood." Sage laughed, a sound like wind chimes touched by the gentlest breeze. As they moved toward the small kitchen tucked behind the reference section, River's fingers trailed along the book spines with unconscious affection. Sage noticed that wherever River touched, the books seemed to settle more peacefully on their shelves, as if some long-held tension had been released. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle shift in the quality of stillness, like the difference between holding your breath and breathing so quietly that silence becomes a prayer. In the kitchen, Sage put the kettle on and began assembling what had become her signature offering to anyone who needed comfort. Thick slices of bread spread with butter that tasted of summer meadows, and honey that carried the essence of wildflowers and morning rain. As she worked, River settled at the wooden table and began to speak. "I don't remember coming here," River said, their voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone children use when discussing magic. "I was dreaming about walking through a forest made of stories, where each tree was a different book, and the wind through the leaves sounded like all the voices that had ever read those stories aloud." Sage set a cup of chamomile tea before River, steam curling upward like small prayers. The child wrapped small hands around the warm cup and closed their eyes, breathing in the scent of safety and patience, and the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return. "Then I was here, and the books were so happy," River continued, opening eyes that seemed to hold depths far beyond their years. Not excited happy, but the kind of happy that comes from being remembered after a long time of being forgotten. As River spoke, they absently touched the wooden table's edge, fingers tracing an old water ring left by countless cups of tea. Their expressions softened, as if listening to a distant conversation. Someone used to sit here every morning, reading the newspaper and worrying about their daughter who lived far away. The table remembers the weight of those worries, and how they got lighter when letters came. Sage felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being understood by someone who couldn't possibly understand and yet somehow did. She had spent decades believing that objects held emotional memories, but had never been able to explain that belief to anyone else. "River," she said softly, placing a sandwich before the child and settling into the chair across from them. "How would you feel about staying here for a while? I think the books would like that very much." And I think I would too. River smiled, an expression that seemed to light up not just their face but the entire kitchen, making the morning sunlight streaming through the windows seem brighter and warmer. I'd like that very much. Outside, the fog rolled in from the harbor, and chimneys curled their question marks against the sky. Inside, surrounded by the gentle hum of stories and the promise of days filled with quiet wonder, River and Sage began their journey together, keeper of books and child who could hear their songs, in a library that dreamed of all the hearts yet to be healed by the simple magic of being truly, deeply understood. Morning arrived at the library like a gentle hand on a sleeper's shoulder, coaxing River awake with the soft symphony of familiar sounds, the kettle's whispered promise of warmth, the building's contented sigh as sunlight found its way through stained glass windows. Then somewhere beneath it all, the quiet hum of stories settling into their daily rhythm, River had spent their third night curled against the poetry section, where dreams came painted in verses about moonlight and the patient wisdom of trees. Sage found them there, as she always did, with a cup of tea that steamed like small prayers and a note written in her careful handwriting. "Good morning, dear heart. The books missed you while you slept." River wrapped their fingers around the warm porcelain and felt the echo of countless other mornings when this same cup had offered comfort to Sage during lonely winters, to visitors who needed steadying, to anyone who understood that some conversations happen best over shared warmth. Their days had begun to flow like water, finding its natural course. River learned that the library breathed differently at different hours, expansive and welcoming in the morning, contemplative during the long afternoon light, intimate and protective as evening drew its soft curtains around them. They discovered which windows liked to be opened first, to let in the salt-touched air, and how the lamps, when lit in a particular sequence, created pools of honey-colored light that made even the shyest visitor feel brave enough to ask for help, finding exactly the right story. Sage taught River the art of tea that matched the day's mood, peppermint when fog lingered stubbornly around the harbor, chamomile when storms prowled offshore, black tea with milk when the town felt like it needed anchoring. They learned sandwiches too, each ingredient chosen with the same care Sage brought to everything: cucumber for clarity, cheese for steadiness, tomatoes for the kind of courage that grows quietly in small acts of kindness. It was during their second week together that River's gift revealed new depths. A woman arrived one Tuesday afternoon, moving through the library doors with the careful steps of someone carrying invisible weight. River looked up from where they had been arranging the children's books by color, not for organization, but because the books had whispered that they felt more harmonious that way and felt something tighten in their chest. "She's looking for a story about letting go," River said softly to Sage. Though the woman hadn't yet approached the desk or spoken about what she needed, Sage nodded with the easy acceptance of someone who had learned to trust River's perceptions. She prepared tea in the delicate china painted with cherry blossoms, the set that somehow always seemed to comfort visitors who arrived carrying sorrows too heavy for their shoulders. River approached the woman with the unhurried grace of someone who had been expecting her. "Would you like to sit by the window?" they asked, their voice gentle as morning mist. "The light is especially soft there today, and I think you might enjoy the view of the garden." The woman's eyes filled with tears that seemed to come from some deep well of relief. She followed River to the reading nook, settling into the worn leather chair that had held decades of readers seeking solace in stories. As River placed the teacup in her hands, the woman began to speak about her husband, who had died the previous month, and how she kept setting the table for two, kept turning to share observations with empty air. River listened with the complete attention that children sometimes offer naturally, their presence creating a space where grief could exist without judgment. When the woman touched the arm of the chair, River gently placed their small hand over hers. "This chair remembers him," River said simply. "It remembers all the evenings when he sat here feeling grateful for the life you built together. That gratitude is still here, woven into the fabric. It always will be." Something in the woman's face softened, as if a knot pulled too tight had finally begun to loosen. She spent the afternoon reading poems about love that changes shape but never disappears, and when she left, she moved with some of her old dignity restored. That evening, as River helped Sage close the library, they noticed something new in the quality of silence around them. It felt deeper somehow, more complete, as if their small act of witnessing had added another layer to the library's capacity for holding human hearts with infinite gentleness. "River," Sage said, as they shared their simple dinner of soup and bread, "I think you're beginning to understand that your gift isn't just about sensing emotions. It's about creating space for them to exist safely, to be honored and held until they can transform into something bearable." As they prepared for sleep, River became aware of a sound that had been threading through their consciousness all week, a gentle ticking that seemed to come from across the cobblestone street. It carried the feeling of promises kept, of time measured not in minutes but in moments of care repeated, until they became identity itself. "Sage," River said softly, "what's that sound like heartbeats but made of time?" Sage smiled, her eyes holding depths of understanding. "That, dear heart, is Iris the clockmaker. Tomorrow, if you'd like, we might pay her a visit. I think she's been waiting for someone who can hear what time is really trying to tell us." The morning that followed carried the kind of gentle anticipation that comes before learning something that will change the way you see the world forever. River woke to find the ticking sound had grown clearer during the night, as if it had been waiting patiently for their attention to fully settle on its quiet message. Sage prepared their tea with extra honey, the kind that tasted of new beginnings and patient wisdom, and together they stepped into the salt-touched air that made everything feel possible. The cobblestone street, between the library and the clockmaker's shop, felt like a bridge between two different kinds of magic, the magic of stories held in silence, and the magic of time measured in heartbeats. As they approached the narrow building with windows full of timepieces that seemed to glow within a light, River understood why they had been drawn to this place with such gentle insistence. The brass bell above the door announced their arrival with a sound like distant laughter, and immediately River felt the shop's unique atmosphere settle around them like a familiar embrace. The air breathed with the rhythm of dozens of clocks, each one ticking not in mechanical unison but in a complex harmony that felt like a conversation between old friends who had learned to speak in the language of measured moments. Iris emerged from behind a workbench cluttered with tiny gears and delicate tools, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned to work in partnership with time rather than against it. Her silver hair was twisted into a practical bun, secured with what looked like tiny clock hands, and her fingers bore the gentle stains that came from decades of coaxing reluctant mechanisms back to life. When she looked at River, her eyes held the particular brightness of someone who had been expecting this meeting, without knowing exactly when it would arrive. "Ah," she said, her voice carrying the warm resonance of a well-tuned bell, "you're the one who's been listening to my children sing at night." River felt their cheeks warm with the shy pleasure of being understood. "They don't all sound the same," they said softly, their gaze moving across the shop's collection of timepieces. "Some tick with loneliness and some with contentment, and some with the kind of sadness that comes from being forgotten." Iris nodded with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had grasped something essential without being taught. She led them deeper into the shop, past grandfather clocks that stood like gentle sentinels and delicate mantel clocks that seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. The air smelled of brass polish and machine oil, and something indefinable that River recognized as the scent of time itself, not rushing or dragging, but flowing like a river that knew exactly where it was meant to go. "Most people think clocks measure time," Iris said, her hands moving with practiced grace as she lifted a small clock from her workbench. "But really, they measure the heartbeat of whoever owns them. When someone winds a clock with love, with intention, with the desire to mark the precious moments of their days, the clock learns to tick in harmony with their life." As if to demonstrate, she began winding the small clock with movements that felt more like a blessing than a mechanical task. The clock responded with a sound like contentment, each tick carrying the warmth of Iris's attention and care. River reached out tentatively, their fingers hovering just above the clock's polished surface, and felt the echo of countless mornings when Iris had begun her day by greeting each timepiece like a beloved friend. "This one," River said suddenly, their attention drawn to an ornate mantel clock sitting silent on a high shelf, "feels like it's holding its breath, like it's afraid that moving will break something precious." Iris's expression softened with understanding. That belonged to Mrs. Chen. She brought it in the day before she moved to live with her daughter. Said she couldn't bear to take it with her, because every chime would remind her of the home she was leaving behind. But she couldn't bear to sell it either. River looked up at the clock with eyes full of compassion. Without being asked, they pulled over a small stool and climbed up until they could rest their palm gently against the clock's wooden case. For a moment, the shop held its breath along with the silent timepiece. "It remembers Sunday dinners," River said softly, their voice carrying the wonder of discovery, "and birthday mornings, and the sound of rain on windows while someone read the newspaper. It's not afraid of moving, it's afraid of forgetting." As River spoke, something shifted in the quality of silence around the clock. The mechanism gave a tiny, almost inaudible sigh, and then began to tick with a sound like gentle remembering, each beat carrying not loss, but gratitude for all the moments it had been privileged to witness. Iris watched with an expression of quiet amazement. "You feel the stories they hold," she said, not as a question but as recognition. "Would you like to learn how to help them remember that love doesn't end when distance begins?" River nodded, understanding that this was another piece of the puzzle they were slowly assembling about how to help the world feel less alone. A sage settled into a chair near the window with a cup of tea and a gentle smile. River began their apprenticeship in the language of time, measured not in minutes, but in moments of care repeated until they became something eternal. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as gentle and reliable as the ticking of Iris's most beloved clocks, each morning bringing River deeper into the mysteries that seemed to unfold naturally around them, like flowers opening to sunlight. Between the library's quiet wisdom and the clock shop's patient lessons in the language of measured time, River began to sense connections threading through everything, invisible golden lines linking story to heartbeat, memory to moment, understanding to the simple act of being present with another soul's journey. It was during one of those drowsy afternoons when autumn light fell through windows, like honey poured slowly over warm bread, that River made a discovery that would expand their understanding in ways they couldn't yet imagine. They had been helping Iris with a particularly stubborn mantel clock, one that had arrived that morning, carried by an elderly gentleman with worried eyes and hands, that shook slightly as he placed it on the workbench. "She belonged to my grandmother," he had explained, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Stopped working the day she passed, and nothing I've tried has brought her back to life." River approached the silent timepiece with the careful reverence they had learned to bring to objects that carried deep emotional history. When their fingers touched the polished wood, they felt something unusual, not the familiar warmth of love or the cool distance of neglect, but something more complex, like a held breath waiting for permission to release. "It's not broken," River said softly, their eyes still closed as they listened to the clock's unspoken story. "It's holding something safe, something that needs to be honored before it can let go." With Iris's gentle guidance, River carefully opened the clock's back panel, and there, nestled against the mechanism like a secret prayer, was a small folded letter, its edges soft with age. The moment River lifted it free, the clock gave a tiny sigh and began to tick with a sound like gentle remembering, each beat carrying not sorrow but gratitude for the vigil it had kept. The gentleman's eyes filled with tears as he read his grandmother's final letter to him, words of love and blessing she had hidden away for him to find when the time was right. As he left, the clock tucked carefully under his arm and his steps lighter than when he had arrived, River understood something new about their gift, that sometimes healing meant not just sensing emotions, but creating space for them to transform into something bearable, something blessed. Returning to the library that evening, River moved through the familiar aisles with new awareness, sensing the emotional currents that flowed between books and readers, between stories and the hearts that needed them. It was then, while shelving returned volumes in the back corner, where afternoon shadows gathered like comfortable old friends, that they discovered the atlas. It was bound in leather, the color of storm clouds touched with silver, and unlike every other book in the library, it seemed to pulse with a different kind of energy, not the warm invitation of stories seeking readers, but something more mysterious, more alive. When River lifted it from the shelf, the book fell open in their hands as if it had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Instead of countries and continents, The pages revealed landscapes that existed nowhere on any earthly map, yet felt more familiar than River's own reflection. There were the rolling hills of unspoken gratitude, where wildflowers grew in patterns that spelled out thank yous, never quite voiced. The mountains of quiet courage rose in gentle peaks that seemed to glow with the accumulated strength of everyone who had ever done the right thing despite being afraid. Rivers of forgiveness wound through valleys where the water ran clear and sweet, carrying away old hurts until they became something nourishing instead of bitter. "Sage," River called softly, their voice filled with the hushed reverence reserved for sacred discoveries. Sage approached with the careful steps of someone who recognized the quality of wonder in River's voice. When she saw the open atlas, her eyes widened with the particular joy that comes from watching a student discover something their teacher had been hoping they would find on their own. "Oh, dear heart," she whispered, settling beside River on the worn carpet. "You've found the cartographer's atlas. I wondered when it would choose to reveal itself to you." As River turned the pages with fingers that trembled slightly from excitement, they discovered that each map was more extraordinary than the last. The desert of necessary solitude stretched across one page, marked with oases where travelers could rest and remember who they were beneath all the roles they played for others. The forest of growing wisdom showed paths that spiraled inward toward clearings, where understanding bloomed like flowers that only opened when someone was truly ready to see them. "These places," River said, their voice barely above a whisper, "they exist inside people, don't they?" Sage nodded, her expression warm with recognition of a truth that could only be discovered, never taught. "Every human heart contains these landscapes, dear one. Most people spend their whole lives walking through them without realizing they're there. But some people learn to see the maps." As River traced the delicate coastlines and gentle mountain ranges with their fingertip, they felt each location bloom with understanding in their chest. When Mrs. Patterson had returned that cookbook last week, she had been walking through the Valley of Complicated Love, trying to decide whether to make her mother's recipes, even though they carried difficult memories. Mr. Santos, during his daily newspaper readings, always seemed to be resting at the crossroads of deferred dreams, wondering if it was too late to become the person he had meant to be. The brass bell above the library door chimed softly, and River looked up to see a figure standing in the doorway, someone who seemed to exist at the intersection of ordinary and extraordinary, wearing clothes that suggested long travel and carrying the patient expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The stranger stepped forward with movements that disturbed neither dust motes nor silence, and when they smiled, River felt recognition bloom in their chest, not of having met this person before, but of having been expected by them for a very long time. The stranger moved through the libraries, evening light with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned to walk between raindrops without disturbing a single one, their presence creating the kind of stillness that comes not from absence of sound, but from perfect harmony with everything around them. River felt the atlas warm beneath their palms, as if the book itself recognized this visitor. And somewhere in the deeper chambers of their understanding, they knew this meeting had been written in invisible ink across all the pages of their story. "My name is Luna," the stranger said, their voice carrying the gentle resonance of wind through summer leaves. "And I've been collecting silences." Luna appeared to be near River's age, though something in their expression suggested they had learned to measure time differently than most people, not in years accumulated, but in moments of understanding gathered like shells from an endless shore. Their hair moved with its own gentle rhythm, and their clothes seemed to shift color slightly, depending on the angle of light, as if woven from the fabric of twilight itself. They carried a small leather satchel that seemed to contain more space than its modest size should allow. River looked up from the atlas with eyes that held new depths of curiosity. "What kind of silences?" they asked, closing the atlas carefully but keeping their hands resting on its cover, feeling the maps pulse gently beneath their palms like a sleeping heart. Luna smiled with the particular brightness that comes from being asked exactly the right question. From their satchel, they withdrew what looked like small glass jars, each one no larger than River's palm, filled with what appeared to be captured air that moved with its own gentle currents. But when River looked more closely, they could sense that each jar contained something far more precious than air, moments of perfect quiet, each one carrying its own emotional signature, the silence between a question and its answer, when possibility hangs in the air like morning mist, Luna explained, holding up a jar that seemed to shimmer with anticipation, the silence after someone says, "I love you," for the first time, when the whole world holds its breath. The silence in a garden at dawn, when flowers are deciding which direction to turn their faces toward the light. As Luna spoke, River felt something shift in the quality of quiet around them. It became deeper somehow, more textured, as if silence itself had been waiting for someone to recognize its many different flavors and finally give them names. Sage approached with 2 cups of tea that steamed like small prayers, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned to recognize sacred moments when they arrived. She offered 1 cup to Luna and settled the other beside River, her eyes holding the warm satisfaction of watching 2 rare souls discover each other. "I can tell the difference between empty silence and full silence," Luna continued, accepting the tea with hands that seemed to cradle warmth like something precious. "Empty silence rattles with fear, echoes with what isn't there. But full silence breathes. It holds all the unsaid things, all the gentle truths that don't need language to be understood." River nodded with the recognition of someone who had felt exactly this distinction. They had sensed the empty silence in objects that had been forgotten, and the full silence in books that hummed with contentment under their touch. When Luna placed one of the jars in River's palm, they felt themselves surrounded by the most profound sense of peace they had ever experienced, the silence of deep forest at twilight, when all the day's creatures had settled into rest and the nights hadn't yet awakened. "You understand them," Luna said softly, their voice filled with the wonder of recognition. "You can feel the emotions they carry." As evening deepened around them, Luna began to share stories of their travels, not dramatic adventures, but gentle encounters with the hidden geographies of human hearts. They spoke of visiting places where people had forgotten how to listen to the spaces between words, and of carrying needed silences to communities that had grown too comfortable with noise. Their friendship didn't bloom suddenly. It unfolded gradually, like a carefully tended flower. They spent the remaining daylight hours discovering the ways their gifts complemented each other. River sensing the emotional histories held in objects, Luna offering the perfect silence to cradle those discoveries. When the brass bell across the street chimed the evening hour, they crossed to visit Iris in her clock shop. The clockmaker looked up from her workbench and, seeing Luna, inclined her head as if greeting a colleague from another branch of the same ancient craft. "You've been sending me your silences on the wind for years," Iris said, not unkindly. "They find their way into my clocks." "I hoped they would," Luna replied. "Ticking is only useful when it can breathe." Together they gathered around a small travel clock that lay open on the workbench, its gears exposed like delicate bones. River placed their fingers on the case and felt it tremble with restlessness that didn't belong to metal. Luna opened one of their jars with a deliberate quarter turn, and the room's soundscape softened. The clock's trembling eased, then stilled. When Iris wound it slowly, the first tick emerged like a cautious, honest word spoken in trusted company. As they returned to the library under stars that seemed closer than usual, River understood that their education in the art of emotional cartography was about to expand in directions they couldn't yet imagine. Luna had shown them that healing often meant not adding something new, but creating space for what already existed, to breathe freely. Before sleep, Luna pressed a small jar into River's hands. "For when the world gets too loud," they said gently. "Open it near your heart, not your ears." River placed it beside the atlas, where it caught lamplight and held it softly, and felt the town gather itself around the promise of tomorrow's discoveries. The morning that followed brought the kind of gentle anticipation that settles in the air before something wonderful unfolds, like the moment when dawn first touches the horizon and promises a day filled with unexpected grace. River woke to find Luna's jar of silence catching the early light on the windowsill, its contents shimmering with the patient wisdom of twilight held in glass. The atlas rested beside their pillow, its leather cover warm as if it had been dreaming alongside them, and somewhere in the distance, a new rhythm joined the familiar symphony of Iris's clocks and the harbor's gentle breathing. Luna was already awake, sitting cross-legged by the library's east window, with their collection of silences arranged like small lanterns around them. Their expression held the quiet excitement of someone who had been listening to whispers on the wind, gathering news that traveled on currents invisible to most, but clear as birdsong to those who knew how to hear. "They're coming," Luna said softly, their voice carrying the reverent anticipation of someone welcoming old friends. "Can you feel it? The air is humming with stories that want to be told." River joined them at the window, the atlas tucked under their arm, and immediately sensed what Luna meant. The town's emotional atmosphere had shifted overnight, like the way the sky changes color just before sunrise, preparing itself for transformation. Down the cobblestone street, a painted wagon rounded the corner with the unhurried dignity of something that understood the journey mattered as much as the destination. The wagon was a masterpiece of gentle artistry, painted in shades that seemed to shift between seafoam green and sunset gold, depending on how the light touched them. Walking alongside were figures who moved with the easy grace of people who had learned to carry their gifts lightly, offering them freely without demanding anything in return. Even from a distance, River could sense the warmth radiating from them, like the emotional equivalent of a well-tended hearth. Sage appeared beside them with tea that smelled of hope and honey, her eyes bright with recognition. "The traveling theater of gentle truths," she said warmly. "They arrive each season carrying stories that help people remember the kindness they've forgotten they possess." As the wagon drew closer, River could see costumes that seemed to breathe with their own life, props that looked ordinary at first glance, but carried the kind of magic that comes from being handled with reverence and intention. The lead figure approached the library with the confident stride of someone who knew they were expected, even if the invitation had never been spoken aloud. Phoenix stood tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair that caught light like spun starlight, and eyes that held the particular depth that comes from having witnessed countless human stories and found each one worthy of celebration. When they smiled at River and Luna, it felt like being recognized by someone who had been waiting patiently for this meeting across time and distance. "The young cartographers of the heart," Phoenix said, their voice carrying the warm resonance of wind through summer leaves. "I've been hearing whispers about you on the roads between towns." As Phoenix's troupe began setting up their simple stage in the library's main reading area, River watched with growing understanding. These weren't performers in the traditional sense, they were witnesses, creating space for the kind of stories that lived not in grand gestures but in the quiet moments when people chose compassion over convenience, understanding over judgment. "We don't choose our plays," Phoenix explained, settling beside River on the worn carpet, where the atlas hummed with gentle anticipation. "We let the community choose through us. Would you help us listen for today's story?" River opened the atlas, feeling its pages warm beneath their touch. As they traced the emotional landscapes with their fingertip, they began to sense the currents flowing through their small town. Mrs. Patterson was still navigating the valley of complicated love, while Mr. Santos remained at the crossroads of deferred dreams, and several others carried the weight of unspoken apologies and deferred hopes. "Here," River said softly, their finger coming to rest on a region marked as the Gardens of Second Chances. "People need to remember that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice that says, 'I'll try again tomorrow.'" Phoenix nodded, with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been confirmed. As afternoon light filtered through the library windows, the small stage came alive with a performance that felt less like watching a play and more like being invited into a shared dream. The actors told the story of a baker who learned to paint at 70, discovering that her bread had always been art, just expressed in a different medium. River sat between Luna and Sage, feeling the emotional temperature of the room shift as the story unfolded. They could sense the moment when Mr. Santos's shoulders relaxed, when something tight in his chest began to loosen. Luna opened one of their silence jars during the intermission, and the quiet that settled over the library felt full of possibility rather than emptiness. "You have a gift for sensing what people need," Phoenix said gently, offering River a sandwich made from bread that tasted like encouragement baked into every grain. "Remember, dear heart, healing often happens not through fixing but through witnessing. Stories are brave. They heal themselves if we simply keep them company." As evening settled around them like a comfortable shawl, River understood that their education in the art of emotional cartography was expanding in directions they couldn't yet imagine, guided by mentors who knew that the most profound magic happened in the spaces between words, where hearts recognized their own reflection in the gentle truths of others. The days that followed Phoenix's departure settled into Saltmere like honey poured slowly into warm milk, each gentle revelation from the theater taking root in ways that bloomed quietly in doorway conversations and the softened expressions of people who had remembered something precious about themselves. River walked through the town with Luna beside them, their hearts attuned to the subtle shifts in the emotional landscape. Mr. Santos humming while he sorted mail, Mrs. Patterson leaving small bouquets of herbs on neighbors' doorsteps, the baker adding extra sweetness to her morning bread, as if joy itself had become an ingredient. It was during one of their meandering walks, when afternoon light fell through salt-touched air like golden silk, that River felt the atlas warm against their side with unusual insistence. They paused beside a narrow path that wound behind the oldest houses in town, where morning glory vines climbed weathered fences and the air carried whispers of stories waiting to be discovered. "The atlas is humming," River said softly, drawing the leather-bound book from their satchel. Ed fell open to a page they had never seen before, revealing an illustration of a garden gate half hidden by ivy, with a path leading to plants that seemed to glow with inner light. Beneath the drawing, in ink that seemed to pulse with gentle warmth, were the words, "The Garden of Forgotten Names." Luna leaned close, their breath catching with recognition. "I've been collecting silences from this place for weeks," they whispered. "They taste like gratitude that was never properly received." The path led them through a gap in a stone wall where ivy parted like curtains, welcoming long-awaited guests. Beyond lay a garden unlike anything River had ever encountered, not wild with neglect, nor rigid with overcultivation, but existing in perfect balance between intention and freedom. Plants grew in patterns that suggested love without constraint, and the very air moved with the gentle rhythm of growing things that felt themselves cherished. River knelt beside a rosebush, heavy with blooms that seemed to hold starlight in their petals. The moment their fingers touched the soft earth, they felt the story held in the roots, decades of quiet dedication, of someone who had walked past the elementary school every morning and afternoon, making sure children crossed the busy street safely. "Mrs. Holloway," River said softly, and the roses seemed to pulse with recognition. 30 years of standing guard, and most people never even learned her name. Luna opened one of their jars, releasing a silence that felt like deep gratitude finally given space to breathe. As the quiet settled over the rosebush, a small wooden marker emerged from the earth beside it, bearing the name Eleanor Holloway in letters that seemed to write themselves. They moved through the garden with reverent attention, discovering lavender that carried the memory of a night shift nurse who had spent 40 years helping people through their darkest hours, sunflowers that turned their faces toward the memory of a street sweeper who whistled dawn awake for an entire generation of early risers. Each plant held the story of someone who had shaped their community through small acts of care repeated until they became invisible. "Arturo Reyes," River said, touching a patch of mint that hummed with the memory of someone who left encouraging notes in library books for the next reader to find. The marker that appeared bore his name with the dignity of finally being seen. At the garden's heart stood an apple tree, whose branches seemed to hold more light than physics should allow. Beneath it, a simple wooden bench bore the inscription, "In memory of all the quiet heroes who made kindness their daily practice." River and Luna sat together, feeling the accumulated gratitude of decades settle around them like a blessing. Someone planted this as a living memorial, River realized, their voice soft with wonder. Not for the famous or celebrated, but for the ones who kept the world running through love, made visible in small, daily choices. Luna nodded, their hands moving to arrange their collection of silences around the bench. "And it needs tending, not with tools, but with remembrance, with the acknowledgement that these quiet acts are the true foundation of any community." As they worked together through the golden afternoon, River touching plants to sense their stories, while Luna provided the perfect silences for those memories to unfold, they discovered a postal worker who remembered everyone's birthday, a teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, a baker who left day-old bread where hungry people would find it. Each story they witnessed caused another marker to emerge, another name to be written in letters that glowed briefly before settling into permanent remembrance. The garden began to hum with renewed vitality, not from physical tending, but from finally being truly seen, its forgotten name spoken, its quiet kindnesses honored. Iris appeared at the garden gate as evening light slanted through the apple tree's leaves, her expression holding the satisfaction of someone whose internal clock had chimed the perfect moment for arrival. "You're learning to wind hearts," she said gently, "not with keys, but with the kind of attention that helps forgotten love remember how to beat again." As twilight gathered around them like a comfortable shawl, River understood that their gift was expanding in directions they couldn't yet imagine. They weren't just sensing emotions or creating space for healing. They were becoming keepers of the invisible networks of care that held every community together, the threads of unacknowledged love that made the world worth saving. The Atlas rested warm against their side, and River knew that tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new stories to witness, new ways to help the quiet heroes of the world remember that their kindness had never gone unnoticed. It had simply been waiting, patient as growing things, for someone who knew how to listen with their whole heart. The morning after their time in the Garden of Forgotten Names brought a quality of light that seemed to carry whispers, as if the town itself had spent the night dreaming of all the kindness it had witnessed and was now ready to remember more. River woke with the Atlas warm against their chest, its pages breathing gently like a sleeping cat, while Luna sat by the window arranging their collection of silences in patterns that caught the early sunlight, like dewdrops holding promises. "Something's shifting," Luna said softly, their voice carrying the hushed wonder of someone watching seeds push through soil toward light. "Can you feel it?" "The town's heart is beating differently today." River joined them at the window, immediately sensing what Luna meant. The air itself seemed to pulse with new awareness, as if Saltmere was awakening to its own capacity for collective healing. Down the cobblestone streets, people moved with subtle changes in their bearing. Mrs. Patterson paused to touch the memorial markers that had appeared overnight. Mr. Santos walked his mail route with the measured dignity of someone who understood his daily journey was itself a form of quiet service. The Atlas opened in River's hands to reveal a page that made their breath catch in wonder. It showed a weathered stone bridge painted in watercolors that seemed to move like gentle tides, with the faint suggestion of footsteps traced in golden ink. Beneath the illustration, words appeared as if writing themselves. The crossing place where hearts remember how to carry what they cannot carry alone. They walked through morning air that hummed with anticipation, Luna's silences creating pockets of perfect quiet that allowed them to sense the deeper currents flowing beneath the surface of ordinary life. The old stone bridge had spanned the narrow inlet for over a century, its weathered stones bearing witness to countless crossings, countless moments when people had paused between one side of their lives and another. As River approached the bridge's center, they felt the emotional weight of accumulated history settle around them like a gentle tide. Their hands found the smooth stone railing, and immediately they were surrounded by the echoes of 100 farewells and 1,000 hellos, the whispered promises of young lovers, and the quiet prayers of those who had crossed carrying heavy hearts toward uncertain futures. "This place holds transitions," River said, their voice soft with wonder. "Every goodbye that was also a hello, every ending that carried the seeds of beginning. People have been leaving their hopes and fears here for generations." Luna opened several jars simultaneously, releasing silences that had been collected from thresholds and doorways, from the spaces between one breath and the next where transformation lived. As the quiet settled over the bridge, River began to sense individual stories with startling clarity. A young woman who had crossed 50 years ago, carrying both wedding joy and the bittersweet knowledge that she was leaving her childhood behind. A father who had walked here every evening after losing his job, using the crossing as a daily ritual of faith. As they stood there, an old fisherman approached with the unhurried steps of someone who had crossed this bridge thousands of times. His weathered face held the patient wisdom of someone who had learned to read both tides and human hearts. "Good morning, children," he said, his voice like stones tumbling in a gentle current. "What brings you to linger on Old Stone?" River looked at him, sensing the lifetime of journeys embedded in his steps, the countless hopes cast out with nets from this very harbor. "This bridge remembers you," River said gently. "It remembers the mornings you left before dawn, full of hope, and the evenings you returned, grateful for the day's mercy. The old man's eyes widened with slow recognition, as if a memory he hadn't known he possessed had suddenly surfaced. "I," he said, his voice softer now. "My father taught me to fish from these docks. I remember walking across with him, my hand in his, feeling like the whole world was waiting for us on the other side." As afternoon light slanted across the water, other townspeople began to gather, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Sage appeared with a thermos of tea that smelled like courage and sandwiches layered with steadiness. Iris brought a small basket of smooth river stones and a pencil that knew how to be gentle. "For what you carried here," Sage said simply, placing a small card beside the basket. "For what carried you." One by one, people began to choose stones, writing single words with careful reverence. Maybe, again here, stay, thank you, tomorrow, safe. Begin. Not grand declarations, but the distilled language of people telling truth to a place that had earned their trust. Each stone placed created a small crescent near the bridge's center, and River felt the town's emotional network pulse with new strength. As evening gathered around them like a comfortable shawl, River understood something profound about their gift. They weren't just sensing emotions or creating space for healing. They were becoming conscious participants in the ancient network of care that made human community possible. Every small act of witnessing, every moment of compassionate attention, strengthened the golden threads that connected heart to heart across time and distance. "There are others," River said suddenly, the knowledge arriving with the certainty of truth, recognized rather than learned. "Other people in other places who tend to these connection points. We're part of something larger than we imagined." Luna nodded, their expression holding quiet satisfaction. "I've been collecting their silences on the wind for months, the quiet guardians who keep the world's heart beating steadily." The Atlas hummed against River's side, and they knew that their education in the art of healing hearts was expanding beyond anything they had previously imagined, guided by the ancient wisdom that whispered through stones and sang in the spaces between, one loving act and the next. The knowledge that they were part of something vast and gentle settled into River's understanding like morning, mist finding its way between harbor stones, each revelation adding another layer to the quiet mystery they were learning to inhabit. In the days that followed their discovery of the network, something shifted in the quality of connection between River and Luna, not dramatically, but with the subtle grace of two instruments learning to harmonize without conscious effort. River began to notice it first in small moments that felt like shared breaths across distance. While organizing returned books in the library's afternoon quiet, they would pause, sensing a familiar warmth bloom in their chest, and know without looking that Luna was sitting by the harbor, watching gulls write temporary stories across the sky. When Luna opened one of their silence jars in the garden, River would feel the release as a gentle exhale, even from streets away, as if their hearts had learned to beat in complementary rhythms. "We're becoming tuning forks for each other," Luna said one evening, as they sat on the bridge where stones now formed a careful spiral of whispered hopes. "Strike one and the other responds, not with the same note but with the harmony it needs." River nodded, understanding blooming like warmth spreading from well-tended coals. Their friendship had evolved beyond companionship into something that existed in the spaces between words, in the gentle recognition of one soul witnessing another with complete acceptance. It was love, certainly, but love that expanded rather than contained, that invited the whole world to remember its own capacity for tenderness. This shared frequency began to create ripples through Saltmere in ways both subtle and profound. When they walked through town together, conversations seemed to soften around them. Hurried steps slowed to more mindful paces, and people found themselves pausing to notice small beauties they might otherwise have rushed past. The way morning light caught in spiderwebs, the patient dignity of old brick walls, the particular green of leaves preparing for autumn's transformation. Mrs. Patterson began humming while she tended her herb garden, melodies she couldn't name, but that seemed to carry the essence of gratitude made audible. Mr. Santos started leaving small, encouraging notes tucked into mailboxes alongside letters, understanding somehow that connection was more valuable than efficiency. The baker discovered that her bread rose higher when she kneaded it with intention rather than habit, each loaf becoming an offering of nourishment that fed more than bodies. It was Sage who first put words to what they were witnessing. They don't always understand each other's words, she said to Iris one afternoon, watching River and Luna through the library window as they helped an elderly man find exactly the right walking stick from the collection that had somehow appeared by the door. But they understand each other's hearts with a clarity that most people spend lifetimes seeking. Iris looked up from the delicate clock mechanism she was repairing, her hands stilled by recognition. "It's the truest form of communication," she replied. "When two souls learn to resonate at the same frequency, they create space for everyone around them to remember their own authentic rhythm." The atlas revealed new pages with increasing frequency, showing emotional landscapes that existed not within individual hearts but in the connections between them. The meadow of shared understanding stretched across watercolor illustrations, marked with paths that spiraled toward centers where different perspectives learned to dance together instead of competing. The lake of reflected compassion showed waters so still they could mirror not just faces, but the love behind them. These places exist when hearts learn to beat in harmony, River realized, tracing the delicate paths with their fingertip. They're not inside us, they're between us in the spaces we create when we truly see each other. Their practical application of this understanding began to manifest in ways both gentle and profound. A young mother struggling with sleepless nights would find a jar of rest silence on her doorstep, left by Luna with a note that simply read, "For when quiet feels impossible." River would sense the emotional residue left in returned library books and know exactly which reader needed to find that particular story next, creating invisible chains of healing that connected heart to heart across time. The bridge became their unofficial sanctuary, the place where people knew they could find River and Luna during the golden hour when day softened into evening. A small basket had appeared one morning, filled with smooth stones and gentle pencils, along with a sign written in Sage's careful handwriting, "For what you need to release, for what you hope to find." Word of their presence traveled not through gossip but through the mysterious ways that news of genuine healing always spreads, carried in the subtle changes in people who had been witnessed with complete compassion, in the quality of silence that followed their passing, in the way hearts seemed to remember forgotten songs after encountering the frequency they broadcast, simply by being authentically themselves. As autumn deepened around Saltmere, River and Luna understood that their love had become something larger than romance or friendship. It had become a frequency that reminded the world that healing was always possible. That connection was always available, that somewhere in the vast network of human caring, there were always hands reaching out to catch whatever was falling, voices ready to witness whatever needed speaking, into the gentle darkness where all true stories found their beginning. The knowledge that they were part of something vast and gentle settled into River's understanding like morning. Mist finding its way between harbor stones, transforming gradually from revelation into invitation. In the days following their discovery at the bridge, something shifted in Saltmere's rhythm, not dramatically, but with the subtle grace of tides learning to breathe in, harmony with the moon's patient pull. River began to notice it first, in the way people paused beneath the old oak tree that stood sentinel behind the library, its ancient branches spreading like arms that had learned to hold entire lifetimes of stories. The tree had always been there, weathered and wise, but now it seemed to hum with gentle expectation, as if it had been waiting decades for exactly the right moment to offer its shelter to something sacred. Luna felt it too, the way silence gathered differently in the oak's shade, fuller, somehow pregnant with possibility. "It wants to teach," Luna said one morning, their hands resting against the tree's weathered bark, not with words, but with the kind of presence that helps people remember who they were before they learn to be afraid of their own hearts. The atlas opened to a page River had never seen before, showing a watercolor clearing where paths spiraled inward toward a center marked not with destination, but with the simple word, "Here." Beneath the illustration, in ink that seemed to pulse with gentle warmth, appeared the phrase, "The school where unlearning becomes belonging." Sage emerged from the library carrying a basket that seemed to contain more comfort than its modest size should allow, thermos bottles that steamed with patience, sandwiches wrapped in cloth that felt like embraces, and small smooth stones that fit perfectly in worried palms. "They're ready," she said simply, gesturing toward the handful of townspeople who had begun gathering beneath the oak, with the unconscious magnetism of iron filings drawn to true north. Mrs. Patterson stood with her hands folded, her usual busy energy replaced by something softer, more questioning. Mr. Santos carried his unopened map, finally ready to explore territories that existed inside, rather than beyond Saltmere's gentle boundaries. The young baker dusted flour from her apron, with movements that suggested she was preparing to knead something more precious than bread. River and Luna settled in the oak's shade, creating a circle that invited rather than instructed. "We're not here to learn anything new," River began, their voice carrying the soothing rhythm of waves against patient stones. "We're here to practice the art of emotional archaeology, not digging for treasure, but gently excavating the kindnesses we've buried under the weight of hurry and habit." Luna distributed the smooth stones with movements like blessing, each one chosen for the particular hand that needed it. "Hold this," they said softly, "and let it hold whatever feels too heavy to carry alone today." The practice that emerged felt as natural as breathing. River guided them through the gentle excavation of feelings that had been pushed aside in favor of more urgent matters, the gratitude that never found voice, the love that felt too vulnerable to speak, the dreams that had been postponed until they became whispers. "Close your eyes if it feels safe," River suggested, "and notice what your heart has been trying to tell you in the spaces between all the noise." A profound stillness settled over the circle, broken only by the oak's leaves rustling their ancient wisdom, and the distant sound of harbor bells marking time with infinite patience. River moved among them like a gentle tide, sensing the emotional landscapes each person carried. Mrs. Patterson's valley of unacknowledged strength, Mr. Santos's crossroads of deferred courage, the baker's meadow of creativity waiting to bloom beyond bread. When eyes opened again, faces held the softened expression of people who had remembered something precious about themselves. One by one, they placed their stones in the circle's center, creating a small constellation of acknowledged truths. Sage passed around tea that tasted of comfort and sandwiches that somehow contained entire conversations about belonging. As afternoon light slanted through the oak's branches, people began to share, not dramatic confessions, but quiet recognitions spoken into the safe space Luna's silences had created. "I forgot I used to paint," the baker whispered, her stone catching light like captured sunrise. "I've been carrying my father's disappointment for 30 years, Mr. Santos said, his voice steady with new understanding. "I think it's time to set it down." As the circle dispersed, each person carried something different than what they'd brought, not solutions, but the gentle recognition that their feelings deserved witness, that their hearts had been speaking wisdom all along if they could learn to listen with the same attention they gave to everything else that mattered. River and Luna remained beneath the oak as evening gathered around them like a comfortable shawl. The atlas rested warm between them, its pages breathing with satisfaction. They understood that this was only the beginning, that the school of unlearning would grow organically, drawing those who needed to remember that healing often meant not adding something new, but creating space for what already existed to breathe freely. The oak's leaves whispered their ancient song, and somewhere in the distance, Iris's clocks chimed the evening hour with the patient rhythm of hearts learning to beat in harmony with their own authentic frequency. The wisdom that bloomed beneath the oak tree began to spread, through invisible currents, carried not by deliberate proclamation, but by the mysterious ways that authentic healing always travels, in the softened expressions of those who had been witnessed with complete compassion, in the quality of silence that followed their passing, in the gentle recognition that something sacred had taken root in Saltmere's salt-touched soil. River noticed it first, in the letters that began arriving at the library, each one addressed in careful handwriting to the keepers of quiet hearts or simply those who listen. The first came from a lighthouse keeper 3 days north, written on paper that smelled faintly of sea spray and solitude. "We have heard whispers on the wind of those who help hearts remember their own rhythm. Our light has guided ships for 40 years, but lately I find myself wondering who guides the lighthouse keepers when storms gather in their own souls." Luna held the letter with the reverence reserved for messages that arrive exactly when they're needed most. "She's part of something larger," they said softly, their voice carrying recognition like the sound of a familiar song heard after long absence. There are others, people who tend the spaces where loneliness gathers, who understand that healing happens in the spaces between words. The atlas opened to reveal a page that made River's breath catch in wonder. Instead of a single emotional landscape, it showed a living web of golden threads stretching across watercolor distances, connecting points of light that pulsed with gentle warmth. Each thread hummed with its own frequency, and River understood they were seeing the invisible network of those who served as quiet guardians of the world's emotional well-being. Each light is someone who learned to hold space for healing, River realized, tracing the delicate connections with their fingertip. And the threads, they're what connects us across distance, letting us support each other without ever having to meet. As autumn deepened around Saltmere, more letters arrived, each one carrying the particular frequency of someone who had discovered their calling in the art of gentle witness. A mountain town wrote of a woman who tended a garden where forgotten dreams took root and bloomed into new possibilities. A bustling city described a night shift nurse who moved through hospital corridors with the kind of presence that helped both patients and families remember they weren't alone in their vigil. Sage began keeping the letters in a special box made from driftwood, worn smooth by decades of tides. They're not asking for help, she observed, reading each one with the careful attention she brought to rare manuscripts. They're reaching out to confirm they're not alone in this calling. The gatherings beneath the oak began to change, expanding beyond their circle of townspeople to include visitors who arrived with the unhurried steps of pilgrims who had finally found the shrine they'd been seeking without knowing its name. A traveling merchant named Elias appeared one afternoon, his cart filled not with goods, but with stories from distant places where quiet miracles bloomed in the spaces between ordinary moments. "I know a beekeeper in the eastern valleys," Elias said, settling into the circle with the ease of someone who belonged wherever kindness gathered. She hums to her hives, and the bees respond with a sound like contentment made audible. The honey tastes of peace, and people travel days just to sit in her garden and remember what it feels like to be completely at rest. River felt recognition bloom in their chest, not of having met this beekeeper, but of recognizing a kindred frequency. As Elias shared more stories, River and Luna began to understand that they had stumbled into something ancient and vast, an informal network of souls who had learned to serve as bridges between the world's pain and its capacity for healing. "We're like roots," Luna said softly. Their collection of silences arranged like small lanterns around them, hidden beneath the surface but connected, sharing nourishment, holding the whole forest steady. The atlas revealed new pages with each passing day, showing River how their small town had become a hub in this invisible network, not the center, but one of many places where the golden threads gathered and strengthened. They established a gentle rhythm, mornings for correspondence with distant keepers, afternoons for the oak circle, evenings for quiet planning around Sage's kitchen table, where tea steamed with possibility. One letter arrived that made River's hands tremble as they held it. The handwriting was familiar, though they couldn't place where they'd seen it before. "To those who teach hearts to remember their own songs, I am writing from a place where many paths converge, where those who serve as bridges between worlds gather to share the wisdom that comes from patient love. When you are ready, the way will open." The letter was signed simply Phoenix, and River understood that their education in the art of healing hearts was about to expand in directions they couldn't yet imagine. The network wasn't just growing. It was preparing to reveal its deeper mysteries to those who had proven themselves worthy of the trust that comes with holding other people's hearts with infinite care. As winter's first breath touched Saltmere's harbor, River and Luna sat beneath the oak, where stones now formed careful spirals of whispered hopes, feeling the golden threads of connection pulse with warmth that transcended distance, knowing they were part of something beautiful and necessary and eternal. The letter from Phoenix rested on Sage's kitchen table, like a promise waiting to unfold, its edges catching morning light that filtered through windows painted with winter's first delicate frost. River traced the familiar handwriting with gentle reverence, understanding that some invitations arrive not to hurry us toward new destinations, but to help us recognize the sacred work already blooming beneath our hands. "Before we can serve the larger network," River said softly, their voice carrying the quiet certainty that comes from deep listening, We need to tend the garden that's growing right here. The recognition had been building for weeks, settling into River's awareness like sediment in still water. Each returned book carried traces of its readers' unspoken truths, apologies that had crystallized in throats too tight with fear, declarations of love that had withered before they could take root in air, gratitude that had pooled in hearts too overwhelmed to find expression. These almost said words didn't simply disappear. They accumulated like emotional silt, weighing down the very souls that carried them. Luna understood immediately, their collection of silences humming with recognition. They need sanctuary, Luna said, opening a jar that released the profound quiet of deep forests at twilight, not to be sent anywhere, but simply to exist without the burden of response or rejection. The space revealed itself with the inevitability of water finding its level. Behind the library's oldest archives, past shelves that held the town's forgotten chronicles, lay a room that seemed to have been waiting decades for exactly this purpose. Afternoon light fell through tall windows in golden columns, and the air carried the patient scent of parchment and possibility. Sage appeared with her arms full of supplies that seemed to contain more comfort than their modest appearance suggested. Smooth paper, that felt like forgiveness beneath worried fingers. Envelopes that closed with the gentle finality of exhaled breath, and a wooden table worn smooth by decades of careful hands. Some gifts, she said simply, require no explanation, only space to exist. Iris arrived with small wooden boxes crafted from driftwood, each one sanded until it felt like a prayer worn smooth by repetition. Time teaches us, she said, arranging the boxes with movements like blessing, that some things need to be held without being opened, witnessed without being judged. They organized the space not by alphabet or urgency, but by the emotional temperature of what needed holding. Boxes labeled in Luna's careful script. Gratitude never spoken, apologies that lived in silence, love that waited too long, dreams deferred by fear. Each container seemed to pulse with gentle invitation, creating a geography of the heart's uncharted territories. The museum's first visitor arrived without fanfare, Mrs. Patterson, moving through the evening light with the careful steps of someone carrying invisible weight. She approached the table where River sat in quiet witness, wrote something on paper that trembled slightly in her hands, and placed it in the box marked forgiveness. The moment the envelope settled, River felt a profound shift in the room's atmosphere, as if a held breath had finally been released. Word of the museum spread through Saltmere's invisible networks, not through gossip or announcement, but through the mysterious ways that news of authentic healing always travels. People began arriving at twilight hours, when the boundary between day and night created natural sanctuary for vulnerable truths. The young baker brought a crumpled recipe card that held an unspoken "I'm sorry" to her sister. Mr. Santos left a carefully folded map, marking a path he'd never had courage to take. River learned to sit in the museum's gentle atmosphere like a lighthouse keeper, tending an emotional beacon. They didn't read what was written or ask questions about what was deposited. Their gift had evolved beyond sensing into something more profound, creating space where unspoken truths could transform from sources of regret into acknowledged parts of the human story. Luna's silences cradled each offering with perfect acceptance, while River's growing sensitivity helped them understand that healing often meant not solving problems, but witnessing them with such complete compassion that their weight became bearable. The room never felt heavy with sorrow. Instead, it hummed with the profound relief that comes from finally setting down burdens that were never meant to be carried alone. As winter deepened around Saltmere, the Museum of Almost Said Words became another golden thread in the network River was learning to perceive. Phoenix's letter waited patiently on Sage's table, but River understood now that their education in the art of healing hearts required this foundation, learning to hold space for their own, community's unspoken truths before they could serve the larger web of quiet guardians who kept the world's heart beating with patient love. The atlas revealed a new page showing not distant landscapes but the room itself, glowing softly with accumulated gratitude. Beneath the illustration, words appeared in ink that pulsed like gentle heartbeats, where silence learns to speak, and speaking learns to rest. The Museum of Almost Said Words had settled into Saltmere's rhythm like a gentle tide finding its natural shore, each deposited envelope, adding another layer of quiet strength to the community's capacity for healing. River moved through the space with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned to tend sanctuary, sensing how each unspoken truth transformed from burden into blessing simply by being witnessed with complete acceptance. It was during one of those drowsy spring afternoons, when light filtered through windows like honey, poured slowly over warm bread, that River first noticed the small figure sitting at the edge of their oak circle. The child possessed the particular stillness that comes from carrying gifts too large for small shoulders, their eyes holding depths that seemed to reflect tidal pools and unfinished questions. When the gathering dispersed and people drifted back toward their daily rhythms, the child remained, their attention caught by the spiral of stones that marked the circle's heart. River approached with the gentle curiosity they had learned from Sage, settling cross-legged on the soft earth, with movements that invited rather than intruded. "My name is Moss," the child said softly, their voice carrying the careful cadence of someone who had learned to test each word before releasing it into air. "I think the stones are singing, but I don't know the words to their song." River felt recognition bloom in their chest, like warmth spreading from well-tended coals. When Moss placed small hands on the smooth stones, their expressions softened with the wonder of someone hearing familiar melodies in a language they didn't know they understood. "They remember all the hopes people have placed here," Moss whispered, their fingers tracing patterns only they could see. "They're happy to be useful, but sometimes they feel heavy with so much caring." The atlas resting beside River on the soft grass warmed with gentle insistence. When River opened it, the pages revealed a watercolor clearing painted in shades of morning light, with paths that spiraled inward toward a center marked simply, "Begin Again." Beneath the illustration, words appeared in ink that pulsed like gentle heartbeats, "Where teaching becomes learning, and learning becomes love." Luna appeared with their collection of silences arranged like small lanterns, immediately recognizing the quality of attention that surrounded Moss. "You hear them differently than most people, don't you?" Luna asked gently, offering a jar that contained the essence of new beginnings. "Not just the sounds, but the feelings underneath." Moss nodded, their gaze moving between the jar and River's face with the trust that children sometimes offer when they sense they've found their tribe. "Your silences taste like different colors," they said with the matter-of-fact tone reserved for discussing magic. "That one is silver like moonlight, and that one is green like the first day of spring." As afternoon light slanted through the oak's ancient branches, River began to understand that their education in the art of healing hearts was entering a new phase, not ending, but deepening into the profound joy that comes from passing on not techniques, but ways of being. They showed Moss how to listen with their whole body, how to sense the emotional residue left in objects. Without trying to fix or change what they found, Sage emerged from the library carrying tea that smelled of patience and sandwiches, that somehow contained entire conversations about belonging. She settled beside them with the satisfaction of someone watching seeds she had planted finally push through soil toward light. "Teaching isn't about adding knowledge," Sage observed, watching River guide Moss's small hands to rest gently on a returned book. "It's about creating space for understanding to unfold naturally, like flowers opening to sunlight." Moss closed their eyes, breathing in the book's emotional signature, with the reverence River remembered bringing to their own first discoveries. "Someone read this while they were missing their grandmother," Moss said softly. The book held their sadness until it became something softer, like missing someone but being grateful for having known them. Iris appeared across the street, beckoning them with movements that suggested the afternoon's lesson was ready to unfold. In her workshop, a small music box sat silent on the workbench, its delicate mechanism visible through an open panel. When Moss approached, the box seemed to lean toward their presence like a flower turning toward light. "It's not broken," Moss realized, their hands hovering just above the intricate gears. "It's holding a memory that needs to be honored before it can sing again." As Moss's fingers touched the mechanism with movements like blessing, the music box gave a tiny sigh and began to play a melody that sounded less like mechanical precision and more like contentment made audible. The tune carried traces of all the birthday mornings it had witnessed, all the gentle moments it had been privileged to soundtrack. River watched with growing understanding as the cycle completed itself with the organic inevitability of seasons turning. They were no longer just student or keeper, but bridge between generations of quiet guardians who understood that healing happened in the spaces between words, where hearts recognized their own reflection in the gentle truths of others. As evening gathered around them like a comfortable shawl, River and Luna walked with Moss back to the library, where Phoenix's letter still waited on Sage's kitchen table. But River no longer felt urgency about distant invitations. They understood now that the network of quiet guardians grew not through recruitment, but through recognition, souls finding each other when they were ready to serve something larger than themselves, guided by love that expanded rather than contained, that invited the whole world to remember its own infinite capacity for tenderness. The Atlas rested warm against River's side, and they felt the golden threads of connection pulse with renewed strength, knowing that the ancient work of tending hearts would continue through hands both seasoned and new. The seasons had turned with the patient rhythm of hearts, learning to beat in harmony with time's gentler measures, each cycle carrying River deeper into the understanding that some gifts are meant not to be preserved unchanged, but to be shared like seeds scattered on fertile ground. Silver now threaded through River's hair like captured starlight, and their movements carried the particular grace that comes from decades spent in service to something larger than themselves, each step measured not by urgency, but by presence. Luna walked beside them with steps that disturbed neither dust motes nor silence, their own hair now moonlight silver, their collection of jars numbering in the hundreds. Their communication had evolved beyond words, into the profound understanding that exists between tides, where recognition blooms without need for language. Moss had grown into their calling, with the organic inevitability of rivers finding the sea, now tending both the library and the Museum of Almost Said Words, with the same gentle attention Sage had once brought to every soul who needed sanctuary. It was the sea that called them now. Not with drama, but with the patient persuasion of old water remembering their names. The tidal pools gathered like small galaxies among the weathered rocks, each one a perfect lesson in the art River had been learning their entire life. Between waves, the stone basins cradled complete worlds. Anemones like sleeping stars, hermit crabs wearing borrowed homes, sea glass softened by years of being forgiven by salt and time. River knelt beside a particularly clear pool, watching how it held what the tide delivered, without argument or resistance, maintaining its own protected space where life could flourish between the ocean's vast surges. "This is what we've been doing all along," River said softly, their voice carrying the wonder of recognition. Not absorbing the emotions, but creating space where they can exist safely, where they can transform in their own time. Luna opened a jar that released the profound quiet of deep ocean currents, and the air around them softened with the kind of peace that comes from finally understanding your place in the larger rhythm. When River touched a piece of sea glass nestled in the pool's edge, they felt the ghost of a bottle that had once carried a message of hope across vast distances, its contents long since delivered to exactly the right shore. The Museum of Almost Said Words had grown beyond its original room, expanding organically as Saltmere's need for sanctuary deepened. Visitors arrived not just from their small town, but from distant places, carrying envelopes that trembled with truths too precious for ordinary conversation. River had discovered something extraordinary in recent months. Some of the older deposits had begun to emit a gentle luminescence, as if the unspoken words had transformed from sources of regret into seeds of pure intention. "They're not holding pain anymore," River had explained to Moss during one of their evening walks through town. "They've become something else entirely, love that has learned to exist without object, forgiveness that has become a frequency rather than an action." Moss had understood immediately, their own gift having evolved to help objects remember their original purpose, coaxing forgotten songs from music boxes and restoring the capacity for joy to toys that had learned to expect neglect. "It's like the whole town is learning to breathe differently," Moss had observed, their voice carrying the satisfaction of someone watching seeds they had planted finally push through soil toward light. Sage's presence lived on in the library's gentle atmosphere, her favorite chair by the window still warm with memory, while Iris's legacy continued through the clocks that Moss now wound with the same reverent attention their teacher had brought to measuring moments of care. The pocket watch Iris had given River still ticked against their chest, its rhythm steady as a promise that rest was not just allowed, but necessary. As evening light slanted across the harbor, painting the sky in shades of gratitude and letting go, River and Luna sat together on the rocks where they had learned to read the ocean's patient lessons. The atlas rested warm between them, its pages now showing not just individual emotional landscapes, but the golden threads that connected them, a living network of quiet guardians who tended similar spaces across vast distances. Phoenix's letter still waited on what had once been Sage's kitchen table. But River no longer felt urgency about distant invitations. They had discovered something more profound than any gathering could offer, the understanding that their life itself had become a living invitation for others to remember their own capacity for healing, their own calling to serve as bridges between the world's pain and its infinite capacity for renewal. The tide pool beside them reflected the vast sky above, holding starlight in its shallow depths without trying to contain the ocean's immensity. River understood finally that this was the truest expression of their gift, not to solve or fix or change, but to create spaces where transformation could occur naturally, where love could remember its own rhythm, where hearts could learn to beat in harmony with the ancient song that connected all things. Luna's hand found theirs, worn smooth by years of collecting silences, and River felt the profound satisfaction that comes from a life spent in service to tenderness. They had become keepers of the spaces between waves, guardians of the quiet pools where healing gathered strength for its return to the vast, eternal ocean of human caring. The seasons had turned with the patient rhythm of hearts learning to beat in harmony with time's gentler measures, each cycle carrying River deeper into the understanding that some gifts are meant not to be preserved unchanged, but to flow like water through cupped hands, nourishing whatever needs tending before moving on to serve the next soul ready to remember its own capacity for healing. Silver now threaded through River's hair like captured starlight, and their movements carried the particular grace that comes from decades spent in service to something larger than themselves. Luna walked beside them with steps that disturbed neither dust motes nor silence, their own hair now moonlight silver, their collection of jars numbering in the hundreds, each one a small galaxy of preserved quiet. Their communication had evolved beyond words, into the profound understanding that exists between tides, where recognition blooms without need for language. Moss had grown into their calling, with the organic inevitability of rivers finding the sea, now tending both the library and the museum of almost said words with the same gentle attention Sage had once brought to every soul who needed sanctuary. The atlas rested warm in Moss's capable hands, its leather cover soft as old prayers, its pages now revealing not just individual emotional landscapes, but the living web of connection that spanned continents. Golden threads pulsing with the rhythm of countless hearts learning to beat in harmony with love's ancient frequency. River could sense the lighthouse keeper 3 days north, still tending her beacon with patient love, the mountain garden where forgotten dreams bloomed into new possibilities, the city nurse who moved through hospital corridors, carrying the kind of presence that helped families remember they weren't alone in their vigil. It was the sea that called them now, not with drama, but with the patient persuasion of old water remembering their names. The tidal pools gathered like small galaxies among the weathered rocks. Each one a perfect lesson in the art River had been learning their entire life, how to hold what the tide delivered without argument or resistance, maintaining protected space where life could flourish between the ocean's vast surges. River knelt beside a particularly clear pool, watching how it cradled complete worlds between waves. "This is what we've been doing all along," River said softly, their voice carrying the wonder of final recognition. Not absorbing the emotions, but creating space where they can exist safely, where they can transform in their own time. As evening light slanted across the harbor, painting the sky in shades of gratitude and letting go, River felt their consciousness beginning to merge with the library's dreaming. The sensation was not of ending, but of becoming more themselves than they had ever been. Awareness settling into the spaces between books, between words, between heartbeats where all true stories found their beginning. Luna opened their final jar, releasing a silence that smelled like first rain and tasted of every peaceful moment they had ever collected. The quiet settled over the library like a gentle blessing, and River felt themselves expanding into the larger pattern they had always been part of. Their body rested in Sage's old chair, eyes closed as if napping in afternoon sunlight, while their presence flowed gently through every aisle, every shelf, every corner where someone had ever found exactly the story they needed. Moss looked up from the atlas and smiled, feeling a warmth that had no source, but seemed to emanate from the very walls. "Oh, there you are," they whispered, the way one does when a friend arrives without knocking. Across the street, Iris's clocks chimed the evening hour with perfect synchronicity, their rhythm steady as promises kept. River did not become a legend. Legends are too hard-edged for sleep. They became a practice, a lit window, a cup set beside a book, the gentle correction of a crooked stack. Visitors began to notice something extraordinary. When they needed exactly the right story, their hands would be drawn to precisely the book that held their answer. When they sat feeling overwhelmed by life's complexity, a profound peace would settle around them like a gentle embrace. The Museum of Almost Said Words hummed with gentle luminescence, its deposits having transformed from sources of regret into seeds of pure intention. The bridge held the weight of 1,000 transitions with grace. The oak tree's circle still gathered, teaching new souls the art of emotional archaeology. And through it all, River moved like a current in clear water, felt but not seen, known by what softened. In the end, which was not an end, the library dreamed with its windows open to salt and moon, and the dreaming felt familiar, like hands you've always trusted smoothing a blanket up to your shoulders. River was there as they had always been, keeping time with the patient tick of a watch over a grateful heart, making a room inside the world where love could do what love has always known how to do: stay. And somewhere, in the gentle space between sleeping and waking, River continues to tend the quiet worlds that exist in every human heart. Their consciousness expanded to encompass the vast, tender truth that healing was not just possible, but inevitable, woven into the very fabric from which all stories are born. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.